Melissa is the Managing Director of Green Infrastructure, Capital Planning and Partnerships at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And she is here to kick off our section on the Unified Stormwater Rule. So take it away, Melissa.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. And thank you, Leonel and Shino, for organizing this wonderful event. It's so nice to be able to kind of step away from our work and engage with you all, even virtually these days, because it's just a nice reminder of everything that we have going on and all the wonderful ideas that you all have as well. So hopefully you've been following along about one of our, I think, most exciting projects over the last couple of years, which is a major overhaul and update of the city's stormwater regulations. So I'm going to present some context on the regulatory framework for stormwater regulations in the city. I'm going to show you all what's changing with our new rules. And then I'm going to walk you through our manual, and that's where I'm going to spend most of my time, because I think that's probably something that you may not have heard in some of our previous presentations if you've been following along. And then I'll just go over some quick next steps and talk about where we are. So, if you were here for Pinar's presentation earlier this morning, you know that we have a very diverse drainage system here in New York. About 60% of our city is combined sewer, and then the other 30 to 40% is served by separate storm sewers. And so our water quality requirements and objectives differ based on these drainage areas. If you think about what we try to do in the combined sewer, you understand that we're looking to control the quantity of stormwater that enters our wastewater treatment facilities during peak events, in order to reduce combined sewer overflows and also just enable the system to perform a little better. And then when you think about the separately sewered areas of the city where stormwater is discharging directly into our water bodies, you can sort of conceptualize that our goals there are really treatment of stormwater. So we want to make sure that the water entering the city's storm sewers is filtered and has reduced pollutants than would happen if it's just discharging directly to those water bodies. So, there's a lot of cities across the country that only have to deal with one of these issues, and maybe they only have one or two water bodies. We're lucky here in New York because we get to deal with it all, and we have several water bodies. Makes the work more challenging, but it also makes it more exciting, I think. So thinking about those two, objectives and our different drainage areas, I would just want to briefly say, we have stormwater rules on the books today. The separately sewered areas of the city have stormwater construction requirements, and this is a program that DEP inherited from the state back in 2019. And so projects that disturb 1 acre or more of soil need to comply with DEP stormwater construction permit. And so there's requirements for erosion and sediment control during construction. And then there's requirements for runoff reduction and post-construction stormwater management practices that need to be implemented, to handle stormwater once your project is constructed. And so those projects are regulated under DEP regulations, chapter 19.1, and they're currently following this stormwater manual you see here with the Statue of Liberty on the cover. And you often hear us refer to those as our water quality requirements, and you'll hear that through the rest of my presentation. So then, even before we inherited this stormwater construction permitting program from the state, we've always had certain requirements for projects that need to connect to the city sewer system. And these are regulated under DEP rules, Chapter 31. You hear us talk about these as the stormwater quantity and flow rate requirements. And basically, anytime a project has a substantial redevelopment, expansion of a building or property, or just something happening as part of redevelopment there, even vertical expansion sometimes, they need to submit what is called a site or a house connection proposal to the city. And this kind of comes through DOB as part of their package to say that they want to redevelop the site. DOB checks a box if they need to come to DEP and submit this proposal. And so what our team here does is reviews that to see if the sewers running adjacent to the property have capacity to accept the flow that's being proposed as part of the new development project. So back in 2012, for those of you who know our GI program very well, you may remember we promulgated a new rule at the same time we were working on the plan that would further restrict the flow from redevelopment projects in combined sewer areas. And so we call it the 2012 Stormwater Rule. And it's been on the books, for a while now. And, the point of that rule was twofold. It was indeed to help with sewer operations, which again is why you'll hear us call it the stormwater quantity and the flow rate rule. But the focus on combined sewer areas was also to achieve some CSO volume reduction, some combined sewer overflow reduction. And so at that time, we studied, what would you need to do in terms of implementing a stormwater facility on an on-site property to control stormwater at a peak flow that would, at the treatment plant, help reduce the frequency of CSO events. And so we developed this maximum discharge rate of 0.25 cubic feet per second while that rainfall event is being managed. And so those projects have been complying with this manual that's on the top of the pictures of our manuals there, and as well as a guideline for detention facility design. And so, pandemic timeline is so weird. I want to say 2 years ago, but it was actually in 2018. We knew that our stormwater or our MS4 permit was changing, and that we were going to be required to reduce that 1 acre threshold. And we'd done a lot of analyses, and many of you followed along with that to figure out what that threshold was. And simultaneously, our colleagues in the Bureau of Water and Sewer Operations were starting to study what the, a maybe more optimal release rate might be. So we came together, it was perfect timing, and we wanted to approach our stormwater regulations with sort of two primary objectives. We wanted to just maximize the benefits we could get for both MS4 water quality and CSO volume reduction, and also just make things a little easier for the development community, because it's really hard sometimes to figure out what drainage area you're in. And also it's hard, the prior site and house connection requirements had this allowable flow requirement, which required developers to go to the local borough office and pull the drainage plan. And then, it was sort of like very complicated to figure out what your rules were. So we were challenged with pushing the envelope as far as we could in terms of getting, the biggest bang for our buck for water quality improvements, but also just streamlining things for the design and developer communities. So with that being said, high level overview of our changes. And I know there's a lot of text on this slide, and we've gone through tons of iterations, and I think this is one of the better ones, but basically the stormwater construction permitting requirements, it's being expanded to the combined sewer system areas. And so it's not just new during and post-construction stormwater management requirements, it's huge. It also means that enforcement, inspection, permitting ability that exists today in the MS4 area is also going into the combined sewer area. And the combined sewer area of the city is much larger than the MS4 area. So this is tremendously increasing the workload of our permitting team. But what it also means is that we have so much more authority to regulate on-site stormwater management in the city, and it's really a big shift here in the agency and across the city. So in addition to the expansion, we're reducing the soil disturbance threshold from 1 acre to 20,000 square feet, which also dramatically increases our number of projects that will trigger the rules. We also added a brand new threshold that includes any project that's creating 5,000 square feet or more of new impervious surfaces. So they now automatically, regardless of their soil disturbance threshold, get kicked into the stormwater construction permitting program. And that was, a part of some of these analyses we ran, to say, where does that significant water quality impact come from new development? And this is a category we wanted to pick up, so we did. The other change is that we're implementing a stormwater management practice hierarchy that's mandatory for both sewer areas. So we have two, and I'm going to show you the combined sewer one, but it's a mandatory hierarchy. And as Pinar mentioned this morning, it focuses on retention first, and that's the goal we're conveying with these new stormwater regs. So that's the 19.1 water quality requirement changes. In addition to that, so we needed to make sure that for the site and house connection proposals, we were also updating those standards, one, to get better water quality practices and water quantity practices, but two, to just make sure we weren't creating an opportunity for loopholes here, because that 20,000 square feet soil disturbance threshold is pretty strict. And so we wanted to make sure there wasn't an opportunity for people to carve up projects and get in and just have to comply with 31 and not have to comply with 19.1. So there were a lot of these different scenarios we had to play through in order to align these requirements, but we did it. So the site and house connection proposals, the release rate requirements have been updated. We have significantly tightened those up for both separately sewered areas and combined sewer areas. And I didn't list them here because the slide kind of gets overwhelming when you lay them out, but we developed the release rates through our green infrastructure program modeling. Actually, as many of you know, we put out this performance metrics report back in 2016. And the purpose of that was to really understand the effectiveness of stormwater or green infrastructure practices on CSO volume reduction by practice type and function. Because, not all practices are the same. Some, if it's a pure infiltration practice, like our right-of-way rain gardens, it's amazing for CSO reduction because the stormwater is completely removed from the system. But unfortunately, you can't do that everywhere, and the benefits vary based on what you're building. Additionally, here in the city, we have these site and house connection proposal requirements to manage more than a water quality event, which is 1.5 inches in New York City. We're looking at, a 5 or a 10-year storm, which is really what individual properties need to manage to protect their property from flooding and issues with the storm system. So what we did here then was tighten up the release rates, which by default increase the amount of stormwater volume that needs to be managed on every site. So we also change the minimum orifice size that's allowed to be implemented as part of detention systems. And what that did, so it used to be 2 inches. We networked with a lot of cities developing these regs, and DC and Philadelphia in particular, who have similar detention requirements, and they were using 1/2 inch orifices to 1 inch. And so we really did some research into the efficacy of those. And what happens, we're tightening up the regs, but by reducing that minimum amorphous size to 1-inch diameter, that allows developers to have, reduce the size of their tanks and go deeper. And so you ultimately get some savings from that offset. And we think that, as we've networked these rules over the years, we think that that's a good benefit. And then finally, where you see the blue and the yellow circles overlap, there's a little green segment. And that's to signify that we finally provided people, or the design community, what they've been asking for, which is clear guidance on how you can use green infrastructure volume to meet both your water quality requirements, which is pretty intuitive, but also your stormwater quantity requirements, which takes a little bit more maneuvering. So then I'm going to switch to the manual now, but I just wanted to briefly share this kind of overview that just hits home again on the different components of each of these permitting programs. So when we talk about the stormwater construction permit, again, this is the program we adopted from the state, and it's not just building green infrastructure. It's you're doing erosion and sedimentation during construction, because in the city, this is huge for us. We see a lot of construction activities where stormwater is being allowed to go directly into our catch basins or into streams uncontrolled. And so the point here is to make sure that stormwater is being managed properly during construction. And then the next three really get to post-construction. So your water quality goals are met by having stormwater management practices that can manage runoff from the small frequent events that trigger those water quality impacts. You also have runoff reduction requirements, which are intended to sort of, make sure the city is performing kind of like how it used to before it was redeveloped, right? So that's the whole intent, is to really get these properties to perform better than just a completely redeveloped property. And then we have no net increase requirements in MS4 priority water bodies that are also included in this stormwater construction permit. And then finally, the site in-house connection proposal requirements. Again, I've mentioned this already, but the intent here is to really capture and manage stormwater from larger events. And I said it's 5-year, but with the unified stormwater rule, it's 10 and over. And it's to help just make our system perform better and to keep the sewers flowing and to protect the plants, and to also help us with combined sewer overflow, and also discharge to water bodies for projects that do that. So shifting into the new manual, this is my favorite part of the presentation, because we spent a lot of time working on this manual. We looked at a lot of other cities. We had a great consulting team. We landed on a manual model based off of the city of Los Angeles. And so they approached their manual with a very kind of like define your performance objectives, and then lay your manual out that way, so that people can say, based on my site, I know I can implement an infiltration practice, and then they can just kind of follow along and do that. So this manual is replacing the 2 manuals that are on our website today. And I mentioned these already. So this new manual will be all encompassing, and it replaces those. It has 6 chapters, and I'm going to just briefly mention these because I'm not going to be able to present on all of them, although I would love to. But chapter 1 is just the introduction, and it kind of tells the story of how and why we're aligning our regs. Chapter 2 goes through great detail on what the actual requirements are for both chapters. Chapter 3 gives the development and review requirements. It's basically like the workflow for the projects that trigger both chapter 19.1 and chapter 31. And then if you trigger chapter 31 only, you get kicked out to our website where all of those site in-house connection proposal applications live. if you trigger chapter 19.1, you go through the rest of the manual and everything in the manual is required. And so chapter 4 is the heart of the manual. This is where we spent the most amount of time and negotiation with all the actors. It's our stormwater management practice selection and design chapter. Chapter 5 includes the post-construction stormwater management requirements. So any project that triggers chapter 19.1, the stormwater construction permit, has to submit a maintenance permit, which gives us the ability to inspect the practice and to require the property owner to certify annually that the practices are functioning. And then every 5 years do like a major certification where they have an engineering review and demonstrate to the city that it's working. And then chapter 6 is a chapter dedicated to the right of way. And this is something that our partner agencies requested many times. And so it sort of delayed the overall manual, but it was the right call because the stormwater management requirements under our stormwater construction permit are kind of hard to communicate. And so this chapter covers the right-of-way projects start to finish. And so it's like a standalone little chapter just for those projects. Okay, so I mentioned that our manual is modeled after the city of LA, and that LA did this great job defining the function of stormwater management practices and then having the manual set up that way. So we have all of our SMP functions defined right up front in chapter 4, and these are pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go through them because I still have a few more slides and I don't know how much time I have, but I think these are pretty self-explanatory. So we have infiltration functioning practices, we have filtration, and the difference between filtration and infiltration is that filtration typically has an outlet pipe. So once that practice is full, stormwater is going to start releasing back to the city sewer system. We have evapotranspiration. Green roofs are the classic example there. Detention tanks are our tool here in the city, and then we have stormwater reuse systems. So one of the best benefits of approaching our manual with this function framework is that it allows a designer to design their practices with a variety of different functions based on what the knowns or unknowns are on the property. So this example on the right is a stormwater planter, and we've shown a schematic of this practice designed as an infiltration device and also as a filtration practice. And so, the manual is going to show you, what are your requirements if you want to do an infiltration practice, and then, if you don't. But that means you can choose a number of different practices and then just tweak the components and have it function slightly differently. And so one reason this works so well, and this is something we experience in the GI program a lot, is that you may need to advance your design before you have your geotechnical information. And so you could choose something like this planter box, this stormwater planter, and you could say, assuming the soils are going to be great, I'm going to design it as an infiltration practice because that's what the city requires. And here are my, requirements for the media depth and the drainage and, the drain down time. But if my geotechnical work comes back and my soils are bad, I can just quickly redesign it to include an outlet pipe so that it can take advantage of the poorly draining soils and get the stormwater, back to the city sewer system if the practice fills up. So that was one flexibility we wanted to include here because we are mandating retention where possible. And so we needed to make sure that we had some opportunities for flexibility in design. And so basically what happens is your practice may change the function just based simply on how you change your components. And then a lot of our guidance is laid out based on your function type. So you'll see that in the next couple slides. The other thing we did too, we included innovated systems in our manual. And this is something that a lot of designers have asked us for. It's hard to like plan out every type of combination system that might be feasible. And we also don't want to over prescribe design, because there are a lot of super smart designers who have been doing green infrastructure for a really long time and they get it. But we wanted to give a couple examples of where you could have a dual function system where one practice is configured to support two functions. So we have this example here of a filtration / detention system, or an infiltration / detention system. And what this does is it allows you, so yes, at the end of the day, it's a detention practice, but at the same time, you're still taking advantage of that natural component of green infrastructure. You're getting some infiltration, maybe through perforated pipes, or you're getting some filtration where stormwater is being filtered through a media and before it goes into the city sewer system. So in both cases, these are adequate, and these are important ways to approach a project, and we wanted to lay that out so that people knew it was acceptable. And again, we do this in the GI program all the time. If we don't have great permeability, we still want to take advantage of the parts of the practice that can infiltrate, because that's the best thing we can do, is to keep whatever amount of stormwater out of the sewer system that we can. Okay, so I mentioned we have two hierarchies. Again, these are mandatory hierarchies. The one I'm showing is for the combined sewer area. The way you read these is tier 1 to tier 3, the dark box to the light, and you read it from left to right, top to bottom. So the top left box is the preferred tier, and that's vegetated retention. And that's our primary goal, and that is in both areas. So when we say vegetated retention, we're looking for a practice that retains stormwater on the property that it's falling on, keeps it out of our sewer system, and we want to see a surface vegetation component to that. And then as you move down the other tiers, you see sort of non-vegetated retention as the next option, which could be a dry well, totally acceptable if you can't do a surface expression. Then you move into detention practices, not our preferred practice, but also have a really great benefit. And we implement them in our program when we need to. And because we have those new release rates, they are extremely effective for combined sewer reduction. So the MS4 hierarchy looks identical to this, except for the bottom, the two bottom tiers, which instead of focusing on detention, they focus on treatment, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a primary goal for MS4 areas. And then both hierarchies have stormwater capture and reuse in this orange box on the side as anytime optional. Stormwater reuse systems are extremely effective. They are retention. They are keeping stormwater out of the system. They may not have a vegetated component, but there are a lot of constrained sites in the city that won't have any other options. And so those are anytime optional, and we want to see a lot of them. I won't go through this. This is another slide with a lot of info, but we have a constraints checklist. I mentioned that the hierarchy is mandatory. And what I mean by that is, as you move down your tier in the hierarchy, you have to demonstrate that you have a constraint that exists on the site that doesn't allow you to implement a higher tier practice. And so this is extremely important documentation. We know people are going to come in and they're going to say, I can't do a rain garden. And that's fine, but they have to demonstrate why they can't. And so some of that demonstration, and documentation is going to include whether you have a soil constraint, which is probably going to be low infiltration rates, whether there are subsurface constraints like high groundwater or bedrock, hotspot constraints, which would limit the use of the land because of potentially existing contamination, surface constraints. There are zoning requirements, for parking and egress that may limit the ability to do a surface expression retention practice in a parking lot. And then also space constraints. So there are certain code requirements that don't allow you to do infiltration practices within 10 feet of a building or a driveway. And so that is going to be something that applicants are going to have to demonstrate as well. So you'll note that the checklist, we have one for the combined sewer and one for the separately sewered area. And again, it focuses on that function type because your constraints differ based on your function type, and then your practice type, and then it lists your constraints. So the stormwater manual, the next couple slides are kind of really like the design components, and people have been asking us this for years. There's a part of the design community, I think, prefers flexibility, but there are also designers who say, just sort of tell us what you want, or show us how to get there. And we experience this in the green infrastructure program a lot, and we've gotten a lot better. We have a lot of manuals now. But this is the first time we've really put some of this stuff down in writing. And again, we've been implementing the program now for 10 years, and we finally kind of know this stuff. And I think now we're at a good place where we can say exactly what we want. And so one of the things we did was created a whole section on how to size your stormwater management practices. And this was super important for aligning our stormwater requirements, because we have two different objectives, but we don't want people to have to build two practices every time. So this gets to that, how do I build GI to accomplish both of your objectives? And so what we're saying here is that your stormwater management practices are generally going to be designed to store your stormwater volume requirements within the practice. And then so you size it for that, and then you figure out how you can apply that volume to your other requirements. So we laid out the formulas, and we also have this little table here, which is a short table, but it's one of the most important tables in the manual, because it really tells you how much credit you get for each of your stormwater management requirements. So if you are constructing an infiltration practice, you get 100% of the water quality volume credit, you get 100% of the runoff reduction volume credit, and you get 50% credit towards your detention tank that you're required to build for the Chapter 31 stormwater quantity requirements. And that's where we finally told everybody the answer. So that's an exciting part for us. And then the next two slides, I'll just go over these really quickly. We have, again, more design tables for our practices based on function. So we, in the GI program, we get this a lot too. What's our max loading ratio? And we used to never say these things, because we wanted people to show us, demonstrate on your property what you think the max loading ratio should be. But for this, we had to kind of set it, because these are for stormwater regulations. And, we have some requirements that we've adopted from the state, and we have to translate those. So we set max loading ratios for all of our practices. We set max contributing area. We have the infiltration rate you need, the surface ponding depths, the depths of your stone base. That's something we get asked a lot. And we have max drawdown time as well. So those are.
Melissa, sorry. We want to wrap it up so we have time for some questions. Sorry, hon.
Can I just go to the last slide? Well, okay. So yeah, just final thoughts here. We've laid out our right-of-way stormwater management practices. I know this is something that is a little confusing to people as they read, but I think these presentations will be available and you'll be able to see it. And then lastly, when are the rules going to be effective? They will be effective in 2 weeks. So the week of February 14th. And the draft rules in the manual are already on our website. We've submitted the final rules to the public record, city record. So they will be published and effective early February, or we're in early February, but 2 weeks. And then links to our resources. And we also just released an FAQ document based on all the public comments we got, which is a pretty good document. And all of this is on our website.